So let's kick off. Why the asterisk? Because I may not touch upon things that you care about. I'm talking about things I care about. And this is, it's an important thing to start off with because depending on who you talk to about Microsoft 365, you can have completely different conversations. For me, wherever possible, I try to actively avoid any engagement around Office 365. If someone said, you've got a guaranteed job for life dealing with Office 365, I'd be like, what time is early retirement? Whereas for me, with my background, things like Windows, Intune, Azure Active Directory are really the way more interesting things for me. So just to give you an idea of some of the things that we will talk about here. Oops. So we'll talk a bit about Windows 10. Not going to go into too many different areas on each of these. Instead, it's just sort of me picking out the things that are probably going to have the biggest impact on what I need to do over the coming year or years, depending on how long it takes for some of these preview features to become real. On the Intune side, I'll give a quick demonstration of this just to sort of go through a few bits and pieces so you can see some of the things we can do now. Office got interesting this year. So, sneak preview. No more MSI-based versions of Office. If you don't think that's a good announcement, you're not going to like anything else I have to say today. Now, the reality here is that this is something that I guess you probably already knew was coming in some form. Like with the 2016 release, the only two versions of Office that were an MSI-based install were the 2-volume license versions. So every consumer version, every retail version, every commercial version that wasn't the 2-volume license ones, all the cloud-based ones were all click to run. So how many of you have already used click to run deployment tools and used the configuration XML files? So good news there is there are some huge improvements in working with configuration XML files. The tool of choice is no longer Notepad. But that's the reality is, you didn't have a lot of options. So using Notepad really wasn't a bad solution. And then just to sort of wrap things up, we'll talk about a few things that are happening with Azure Active Directory, just in terms of preventing us from doing harm to ourselves, or people inside our tenants doing harm to us and everyone else we work with. So the two Windows 10 pieces I'll just sort of cover off quickly. First off, Autopilot. So I'll kick off an Autopilot demonstration because I've still found that it's something that some people haven't heard of, some people haven't seen it yet. So how many of you haven't seen an Autopilot deployment of Windows 10? Okay, so a few of you. Now, the good news is that it's not very exciting because it's just really Windows preventing users from, we don't want Outlook, that was my mistake. Okay, so this is a side effect of that crash we saw earlier. There we go, that's much better. Okay, so this is a machine that I've just done. Anyone who was in the room earlier saw I went into Intune, did a reset on this machine. So the reset goes through, and in this case I did a full wipe. So like I don't want any user settings, I don't want any apps, I just want something nice and clean. So just get that out of the way, and I'll be lazy so that I don't have to scroll and say yes. So far, if this was a new machine out of box, and let's say it's a Windows 10 Pro machine, the questions I haven't had to answer yet are, is this a work or personal device? What's the likelihood if you gave a Pro device to someone and they were going through the out-of-box experience that they'd select personal instead of work? I'd put it up at around 50-50. And my logic process there is, it's a work PC, but I'm the only person who's using it, therefore it's personal. So we can start suppressing some of those types of screens. We can suppress things around, do you want to sign in with an Azure AD account or an Active Directory account? Removing things such as the user being given the option to accept or decline the OEM EULA, the Microsoft EULA, and Cortana, and privacy and settings. What else do you normally get asked in? I think it's like 43 screens if every one of them gets exposed to you. So here we sort of see something where effectively it's just sort of coming up and going, oh, we know we know who this device is, or we know the tenant that this device is associated with. So in this case, I can just sign in and try to remember I always should actually do a run through trying to remember the password before I do these things.
Is that a customized message down the bottom? Or the official one?
See, you've actually seen this tenant before. You saw this tenant about a year ago, but it may have featured a certain bird in all of the iconography.
I do remember that, yeah.
Yes, yes. I got to the point where it's like, yeah, I need to change it so it looks like I'm using a new tenant. So all it's really doing me is giving me the opportunity to go through and sign in with credentials associated with the organization. Now, there's some other things we can make even easier as we go through this. So do you like the idea of the user not even having to enter their password?
Yes.
As long as it's still, Pete's looking at me very nervously. Passwords, bad. Multi-factor authentication, good. So at this stage, we can do a couple of things here. And the way that I've got it set up is I can click on continue anyway. And this is really where we have to make a trade-off when we're doing the configuration of autopilot. Do we want to prevent the user from doing anything until the system is set up the way that we want it? Now, if you've got a good internet connection, the answer is yes. However, if you're shipping devices off to random locations with potentially horrible internet connections, and one of the things I'm doing here is I'm pushing an Office click to run deployment down across the internet. So if someone's got an ADSL1 connection, they'd be sitting there waiting for a day or two probably to actually use their computer. Now, I can actually go through and click on continue anyway, but before we do that, we can see what's going on. It's scanning the hardware, joining to Azure AD, doing the device setup, and it's going to take a while for it to go through and do all of that. So let's just come back in. So some of the important things with autopilot versus just doing a regular Azure AD join. The user doesn't have to end up with local admin rights. Now, for those of you in the room, like how many of you have done an Azure AD join and kept using the device as a local admin? Yeah, this is one of those do as I say, not what I do type of situations. So just let me come back in. So in this case, the user will just be coming in as a local user. Need to switch modes. So that we don't have to worry about what are they going to be doing afterwards. Now I'll just set up a pin. You'll see the first exciting MFA portion of the day. This isn't the exciting MFA demo. The exciting one comes later. And by exciting, I don't really mean exciting. It's different.
You're not selling.
Oh no, the one that's coming up is the good one. Okay, so just putting a pin on. Sorry?
Is your mobile on Telstra?
Yeah.
So they fixed
Okay, so a few things to note. I didn't get the default Windows 10 screen because I've got Azure AD enabled, I've got enterprise state roaming, things like customizations to the browser, etc., settings sync, etc. I've got those enabled by default. So the idea here is that if I'm setting up a new device for a user, we can start replicating a lot of the capabilities that we may already have set up on the other device. Now, a few things that you'll see in here is that it hasn't gone through and installed Office yet, and the way that I can tell is that it hasn't populated some of the tiles that I've pre-populated in the start menu here. And really the way that we can tell when Office is getting ready to, actually, I've got, really wants BitLocker enabled, but we won't do that right now. So the way that we can tell that when Office is getting ready to install, and let's see, so far it doesn't look as if Office is ready. No, just being a little bit impatient here. But what we'll see is that the click to run installation process will kick off as one of the items in here. Now, we can sort of come back to that. So this is where you can start seeing that this is going to be very, the experience here is very dependent on the network environment. Now, if you're thinking, that means I can never use it in my environment. Never is a very long period of time. Instead, you should be thinking, I wonder if there's something in the pipeline that might allow me to use this in my environment where I may be somewhat bandwidth restricted. So before I close out of here, let's just have another scroll to see if any of the Office click to run bits are kicking in yet. There we go. So click to run is kicking in, so we'll start seeing that these pieces will get populated. So we'll come back in a few minutes and take a look at that. And I'll also show you some of the things behind the scenes that are configuring those. So we'll let that run because we don't really just want to watch installation bars for stupid amounts of time. So there were a few autopilot announcements that were made at Ignite, but just to sort of go through some of the things that we have to think about right now if we're building devices. Generally, the things that we have to factor in when we're getting new hardware shipped out to us, if we're going through cracking the seal, re-imaging everything, running sysprep again, and then getting it out to a user, like who does things this way? Yeah, pretty much everyone does it that way. But if you take a look at the reasons why in the past we may have built out an SOE and just kept deploying it, do all of those things make sense today? Some people will go, well, in our environment, we're special and we can never change. It's like, again, never is a very long time period. So there'll be situations like this where it's not necessarily saying that this is wrong. Obviously, it can't be wrong if people have had great success with it. It's just that it's not the most, the most efficient way of actually going out and doing deployments. So what we talk about here is effectively, is there a possibility we could ship the device straight to a user, regardless of where the user is? And let's use an analogy here. Does a phone go back to IT to get configured before it gets handed to a user?
Yeah.
Yes.
If you're the one who has to do the manual setup. Yeah, but if it's a user who knows what they're doing and they know how to enter their username and password into the apps, it's not something where IT needs to get heavily involved. You could use something like Intune to go through and force an enrollment of the device so that they can start accessing email. But here what we really want to do is, let's talk about some of the roadblocks that we're going to have with this. First of all, what we really want is for somewhere through the supply chain for the unique hardware ID to get populated into the autopilot service in Microsoft's cloud. So that effectively eliminates anything purchased through retail channels. It effectively moves anything that's not built with autopilot in mind from the OEM from this being something that the OEM will put their hand up and say, we will support this. So if you think about the types of models that are going to support this, think of the business or the commercial devices that generally where you might pay a bit extra to get all the crap removed from them before the OEM ships it to you. So this would effectively be part of that type of service. So right now you'll find that the different OEMs are offering they're wrapping it up in different ways. So the first group that's gone out and offered it is the Surface commercial team. So notice I said commercial, because if you go into the Microsoft, if you fly up to Sydney just to go to the Microsoft store and buy a Surface Pro, it's not going to participate in this automatically. But if you think about it from the OEM side, the way that I can really see this moving is like the OEM is going to use this to shift you towards, if you want this capability, they'll shift you towards buying the hardware that they want you to have. Does that mean that you can't use other hardware? No, as long as it's got Win 10 Pro 17 or 3 or higher on it, you could go through, harvest the device IDs, kind of a high touch thing, and that then gets back into the conversation of, well, if we're going back and cracking the seal to harvest the ID before shipping it back out to the user, why don't we just put an image on it, or why doesn't IT get more involved in that initial stage? So the idea here is we want a machine with a somewhat clean image. We don't want the OEM crap in there. We don't want, if it's something that's required to make function keys work, okay, that's fine. But if it's a 30-day trial of insert random antivirus vendor or any antivirus vendor, that's not the kind of thing we want on here. We just want to be able to give the device to the user and have it go through a pretty quick transformation process so that we can get it into the state that we want for the user. So if we take a look at some of the benefits that are here, and so no more maintenance of images and drivers. Well, you probably still want to at least have something on-prem for break-fix scenarios, but it's not going to be that, let's manage our, how many of you have got like a complex management solution for managing the different WIM files and images that you've created over the years? And how many of those images, if I started poking down several layers, would I start finding ghost images that haven't been used for 10 plus years? And look, and this is normal. And the thing that sort of allows a lot of that stuff to happen is you'll go in and you go, why the hell do you have all of this? And they're like, oh, we enabled dedupe, so it's not costing us anything in storage. It's like, that's no excuse. So we still want to have some of those things. We don't want IT to have to sort of touch the devices before they go out to users. That experience that you saw me go through, the only real possibility for the user to not get it right is when it says, whether it's, if they don't plug Ethernet adapter in or if they can't join the Wi-Fi network they need to join. So the Wi-Fi network side is one where it's a little bit of a gotcha, because if you've got something that requires certificates or anything like that before you can get any external connectivity, this isn't going to work. So instead, if you are doing deployments, setting up a temporary guest network so you can at least do the enrollment, then have, as part of that Intune process, have it push out the appropriate, Wi-Fi certs and VPN certs for you so that when the device comes back online, it can connect. Now, this piece, the fourth option there, integration in the device supply chain. What we'll effectively see in a lot of cases is even if we're buying models where the OEM doesn't necessarily support that, or autopilot for that model, somewhere through the supply chain, somebody is happy to charge you money for that. So how many of you are Microsoft partners? Anyone? Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, it's like, okay, this is part of the service. We'll crack the seal, we'll harvest those IDs and send it through. Or alternatively, your distributors who you buy your hardware from will also be offering these types of services. So that way they'll be able to offer it across a pretty broad range of devices. If your distributor that you're buying hardware through is also the CSP provider that you're buying through, then it gets pretty easy for you to give them consent to start uploading these IDs into Azure AD for you. So some of these things actually do work quite well. Now, reset the device back to a business ready state. Effectively, this VM that I'm using here, I've been using for about a year and a half. Like, I'd hate to think of how many times I've gone through and reset it to get through this process. But the idea here is that we start thinking about it in terms of life cycle management, and effectively we could go through and retire it at the end of that process if needed. Now, an important part of the retiring process is we need to disassociate the device from our tenant. Otherwise, anyone who's doing a fresh Windows installation with an internet connection, they're going to get hijacked and taken back to our organization's login screen. So just be a little bit careful of that one. If you do some testing on a device and then hand it to someone else, you will get a call at some point in the future. So the two scenarios that are available at the moment, user-driven mode, the autopilot with local reset. Two that are in public preview right now, remote reset, which I went through and I've already done today, so that's, and I can do it again at the end of this. Self-deploying mode, so that we can start pushing out to a device where, think of it not as a device that's necessarily a device that's a user's device. Think of it more in terms of it being like a fixed function device or a kiosk device, where effectively we're assigning things to the device. We don't really care about who is the person who's going to be using that device. With hybrid Azure AD join, now there are a couple of things going on with the hybrid Azure AD join. You'll see some of the scenarios here will be you doing a cloud-based Azure AD enrollment. You'll get pushed the appropriate package for it to get a VPN tunnel back to on-prem, join AD, and as part of all of that, also install the config manager client for you. There, I said config manager for you. That's it, no more. That's the end. But But other options that they're also talking about, and I think that they're also previewing, are the ability for us to go through and do a deployment on-prem without having to do all the work around how do we get it to tunnel back into the organization to guarantee that it's got line of sight to a domain controller. So in this case, we could use Autopilot to just do a pure, or it would actually be a hybrid join, to do an on-prem AD join and do an automatic Azure AD registration, which would be pretty good for your type of scenario. So what they're doing here is really reaching out and looking at, not just that initial, let's ship a device directly to the user regardless of where they are. That's what started it off. But it's still one of the big goals of the product. But now there are more capabilities that they're adding. So actually, we get to talk about Config Manager again. So I think it was maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago now, they put out the blog post around going through and they've published this where we're pulling our Autopilot information out of our tenant via the Graph API and saving a profile that we can drop into Windows images, so that as we're doing something like a Windows 7 to Windows 10 migration, effectively we could roll out the new image, drop that package in, and have it automatically do the Azure AD join through that. So that way we don't actually have to go through and do that pre-enroll of the device. Instead, we're telling it specifically what tenant to go through and join. So we start seeing a whole bunch of different scenarios now versus that initial one, which was quite limited, but it's like anything. If they started by saying, we want to do all of these things, none of them would succeed. So instead it's like, let's just sort of tick them off one by one. Now let's just switch back and see how this machine's going. Oh, look at that. So you'll see the reason why some of the Office bits haven't started lighting up in here. I'll talk about those as we go through. But you can see here that Office is in here. If I click on Word, pretty exciting, it's Word. Pre-activated because I've signed in, I'm getting single sign-on because I've already gone through and authenticated against Azure AD, so I don't really need to do much in terms of configuration. So a pretty easy process to go through and have some of these things get pushed out automatically. Now if we jump in and take a look in here, let's, actually, what do we want? We want, yes, I know I have to click a lot of times to get to this, but there we go. We're at 1.6 gig. Okay. Now, that's slightly more than what we'd normally have if we were just doing the Office Click to Run install, because I've gone through and I've got a few Windows Store apps included as well. So we've got DocuSign, I've got the Intune client in there. So I've got a few things pushed out already. So this leads into the next part, which is I didn't realize it would be such a perfect flow from lots of bandwidth to delivery optimization. So how many of you have looked at Windows 10's delivery optimization yet? Or seen it in Windows Update and wondered what it was? Okay, so to give you an idea of how, this is something that's absolutely critical for Microsoft, because as much as we'd all love to live in a world where bandwidth is not a concern, apart from the 5 cities in the world that we hear about all the time, bandwidth is a concern for pretty much everyone. Pretty much everyone. So with delivery optimization, some of the important things here is it's cloud managed, but you control how it works in your environment. Now, if you just let things work as by default, you may or may not see the types of results you expect. You'll see some results. They might be really good results as far as Microsoft is concerned, but they might be terrible results as far as your network is concerned. And we'll loop back to some of those. So each device contributes to reduce overall bandwidth. So effectively, we've got peer-to-peer inside of our network. We can pull down from multiple sources. So we can pull from the internet, or we could pull down from local, or pull down from local devices. We can do that in parallel. And the final bullet point here, fast and furious. Who thinks that's a good thing, fast and furious? There should be an asterisk at the end of that, because it assumes, but it assumes that your network can deal with this. Because if you've got a bunch of clients lighting up and going, I've got that thing that you're looking for, and 20 other clients light up and say, I also have it. If you're in a wired connection, you're probably not going to really complain too much about any network activity that's generated. But what if every device on your network is on Wi-Fi? Are your Wi-Fi access points going to cope with this kind of internal traffic versus the normal traffic they'd normally be coping with? And this is one of the things that I've had people complain to me going, this thing kept resetting our access points. And there's an official answer to that: get better access points. Or put restriction policies in to reduce how much traffic is actually going across them. So this is one of those things where we're moving the bottleneck away from your internet connection. So we have to think about how that's going to have an impact internally. So with the publishing, everything gets chunked and hashed. Now, some of the important things here is that anyone who's sort of looked at delivery optimization already knows that it knows how to deal with Windows updates, so the feature updates, the security updates, your Defender signatures, any drivers that get pushed out, but also things like your Microsoft Store apps and the Microsoft Store for Business apps also benefit from this. So how many of you have installed something big from the Windows Store, like the Windows subsystem for Linux, something along those lines? Pete, put your hand up for that one. Yeah, thanks. There's always got to be one person who works for Microsoft putting their hand up to downloading something from the Windows Store. Sorry, the Microsoft Store.
Oh, yeah, you did that before.
Yeah, okay. So in this case, if it's something that multiple people then need after Pete's already got it, they can, when they're sort of going through and querying the delivery optimization service, it's actually tracking what activity it's seeing in terms of client requests and what it's delivered versus the external IP address that you're coming from. So it can go, hey, within the last X number of days, someone in your organization has downloaded that. So if you just sort of do a query inside your network, here are the ports that it goes across, all documented, we might be able to pull that down at network speed as opposed to your internet speed, which is probably a hell of a lot worse than your internet speed in most cases. Now, here's where things start getting way more interesting. So for the last few months, Office Pro Plus updates or any of your cloud-based Office click-to-run versions that get updates via Microsoft's SDN have been doing this distribution already. Now, this normally works out to be around, if you're on the semi-annual channel and you're getting the 6-month feature updates, this works out at around 50 meg per device per month. So it's not, not a huge amount. However, within the next few months, we'll be able to remove updates from this slide. So that means that 1.6 gig deployment I just did, I could actually start querying other machines in my network to see, do you have bits of Office that I can grab from you? So all of a sudden, that one change completely changes some of the ways that we can start thinking about this. Because even with some of the autopilot scenarios I've had to work with, we're more than happy for Intune to do ongoing management of the device and to push small apps out. But when it comes to that initial Office installation, for a lot of organizations, we've had to jump back into the ODT, create the configuration XML file, point it back to an on-prem file server, and use Intune to push a PowerShell script out that does that installation. That's a lot of work for a cloud solution. Whereas now we can start going, so this is something that really starts to get way, way better. Now, supported platforms. So some important ones here. As you'd expect, Windows 10, Windows Server also supports it, and Xbox One. Very important.
Office on Xbox?
No, so think about, let's replace things here. Let's replace Windows with Xbox updates.
Yeah.
So let's say you're a multi-Xbox household, and one of you is downloading, let's assume we're in a future that hopefully is pretty close, and Gears of War comes out, or Gears of War 5 comes out. Does anyone play Gears of War? 4? And does anyone know how big that currently is if you were to download all of it? I think it's about 80 gig, something like that.
Or Red Dead Redemption.
Yeah, that's probably, yeah. So in this case, if it's a multi-Xbox household, because it's running on a Windows 10 variant, it benefits from this. Now, I don't really think that's going to impact too many people, but things effectively replacing Windows with Xbox, Microsoft Store apps with Xbox apps, and you can start to get an idea that this is something that Microsoft has built to scale out. Now, I mentioned for the download that we can pull from Microsoft's HTTP service, but we can also start pulling from local servers, local distribution points, effectively other clients. One of the things that was mentioned briefly as a throwaway comment during Ignite was that they're also considering doing a delivery optimization of clients. And they said, we'll get back and talk about that at the end of the session, but they didn't. Because I think they were probably supposed to say nothing at all, saying, that's a great idea, well, go to user voice and submit it. That way I can justify the work I've already been doing. Now, the reality here is if we think about what a delivery optimization server might be based on, more than, like, my guess without any information whatsoever, so I'll make an educated guess, it will be something that runs on top of Nano Server 2019 or on top of Windows Server Core 2019. So they'll make it available in a way that that's pretty easy for you to deploy. It'll be a pre-configured appliance. Important to note, though, it's not a general purpose caching solution. It's only for delivery optimization. So if you've already got any kind of WAN accelerator or caching service or whatever in place, this is not designed to compete with that or replace that. It's purely around delivery optimization. So with the caching, the client checks in, and when it's doing a check, it also lets the service know, here's what I've still got available. So there are algorithms where when it's checking in, the service will let it know, get rid of that content, we don't really need it any longer. I think by default it keeps content for around 7 days. You can bump it up to 60 days if you really want to. Now, if you think about that 60-day period, you'll probably really be hard pressed to go outside of 30 days in a lot of cases. Because if you're thinking about things like the Windows cumulative updates, which are probably going to be the big one for you in terms of bandwidth savings, you're getting new versions of those every 30 days. So you don't really need to keep too much that's old out there. With things like your Office updates, however, if you're on semi-annual channel release, then that's a 6-month window, and I don't think it will go all the way out to 6 months. But if are any of you on monthly targeted or monthly update cycles for your Office apps? So yeah, so in that case, that would be something where, that would definitely be within that 30 days. So here's all the settings you get for delivery optimization. So right now, it's pretty easy to go through, set it in group policy. On the Intune side, you don't get access to all of this. You can go through and drop in CSPs in Intune to configure everything that's here. But the Intune team is a little bit behind in actually exposing all of this functionality. But some of the important things in here, just to point out. First up, you'll see there are some scenarios or some of the options we get that we can set different behaviors for foreground and background traffic. So, or foreground and background updates. So a foreground update is I go to Windows Update and say, check for updates. Or I go into the Office client and go, check for updates. So that's where it goes, if you're asking me to look for this, you must really need it. So what you'll generally see when you're doing a comparison on a machine that where someone does have the ability to install things, you'll find that, generally it's going to be, like I've noticed that it's normally like 2 to 3 times faster when you check for it versus just letting it be a background download. Now, other things we can start doing in order to shape the traffic the way that we want it, we can start doing things like delaying foreground or background downloads from HTTP. So we can say, before you try to pull anything from HTTP, wait X amount of time and try to get it locally. And this is one of the ways that if you are trying to say, look, I want to try to get, let's say, 70 or 80% of this content inside my network as opposed to from the web. These are some of the things that we can start doing. Now, another important one in here, you'll see there's a few bandwidth restriction ones in here, but the other ones that I want to sort of find in here, where is it? So enable peak caching while the device connects via VPN. No. So so they've got a lot of different settings in here that we can go through and start, trying to make sure that it's not going to impact, the way that somebody is working. So we've got delivery optimization now being promoted to the top level on update and security, whereas previously we had to go into Windows Update, advanced options, scroll down a page or two, then we'd find delivery optimization underneath that. So this is something that, obviously is going to become, absolutely critical for Microsoft in terms of these types of conversations. We've got PowerShell scripts where we can check what's going on. Generally, so Microsoft's internal target initially when they were rolling this out was they wanted 50% utilization, but they got to that without even breaking a sweat. And during the MVP summit earlier this year, this was one of the first times where I'd really seen this light up, because we were there during when an insider build was released, and I was sort of looking at, as we tend to do, I was looking at Resource Manager, and it was like, holy crap, I'm connected to 20 other machines inside the network, pulling things down, and it came down way faster, and it was something like 52% was from inside the network and 48%. So that 50% target Microsoft was aiming for, I was pretty much right on that. Now let's switch gears a little bit. We've spoken about Office.
15-minute warning.
Okay, so year number with Office means that the version of Office you have is never current. Any reactions from people on that? So when was Office 2019 released? Last month? Guess what? It's already old. There are already versions of Office available that have got more features than a version of Office with a year number in it. So even Office 20, so up until a month ago, how many of you thought Office 2016 was a current version of Office? Who's not willing to put their hand up now? So depending on how you count it, it was either 5 or 6 versions old or 24 versions old, depending on if you're in the 6-month update cycle or in the monthly update cycle. Now, I made up this acronym myself, C2R for everyone. I put a lot of thought into that one. Now, there. Okay, so before, I had this in here as a backup in case someone said there's always going to be a week or two. It's like, yeah, you've already missed it. Too late. Now, here's the Office 365 Pro Plus story. So this is going from that original launch and then the additional features that were added in over time. So this is one of the things that I just find that, again, a lot of organizations that haven't really standardized on a version of Office. They'll go, well, we use the current one. And it's like, that doesn't mean anything. Be very, what version number are you using? And if they say 2016 or 2019, so these are things where this also has an impact in terms of what the Office support lifecycle looks like. And one of the things that was sort of happening, like an announcement came out sometime last year, I think, or early this year, where Microsoft was talking about that as far as Office 365 is concerned, that Office 2016 won't be treated as a first-class citizen from October 2020 onwards. There are a whole bunch of announcements made at the same time. But effectively, that's the first time that Microsoft had really come out and said, if you are using a non-updatable version of applications, don't expect them to be great clients to services that are constantly being updated. Now, Microsoft has backtracked since then and given another 3 years of Office 2016 being a first-class citizen into Office 365. But effectively, this is that first time where they've come out and said, look, if you want to be consuming Office 365, Office Professional Plus or Office Standard or Office with year numbers are not the right versions for that. And this is something that, with that initial 2020 date, I really liked it because it was quite an aggressive message and it was like a pretty strong message to come out with. I don't like it when Microsoft backtracks on these things because it means that for some people there's an expectation that as they get closer to whatever the new expiry date is, they'll think, oh, Microsoft will extend it again. But I think the reality here is that like a lot of the education for people realizing that, just because you've got what you believe to be the current version of Office doesn't actually mean it's got the current features that are actually required. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that with 2019, even with Office 2019 now, all versions are click to run. So we're at the point now where anyone who's been resisting moving to like an Office subscription version because they've invested heavily in deployment of MSI, well, if you want to keep using a version of Office that's 24 versions old, you can keep using Office 2016. Probably not a good long-term story. But where things start getting more interesting now with Office 2019 being click-to-run based is effectively it's a group policy setting to switch it from your Office 2019 over to an Office 365 subscription. So for someone who's sort of in that interim period where you're not quite ready to change licensing yet, well, you don't have a choice about the type of package you can deploy. But the good news is that the skills that you pick up move over and translate pretty easily. For anyone who's already working with Click to Run, like this is just more of the same of what you've been doing. And I think Click to Run, we first got access to that with like when Office 2013 was launched. So some of you have probably been working with Click to Run in some form for the last 4 or 5 years. So any of the investment that you've made around your tips and tricks, all of that stuff still carries forward. Now, obviously, important things here when they had to make sure that when they were ready to say bye-bye MSI, that they had something that was going to replace it and was going to minimize the ability for people to go, well, we can't move because it doesn't support this or it doesn't support that. Another change that came through with the Office 2019 announcement, though, and this is one that I think is going to make most of you incredibly uncomfortable with. The default deployment recommendation moved from 32-bit Office to 64-bit Office. So who thinks that's a good idea? Who is nervous about doing it in their own environment? Look, if you know that if you're auditing your environment, if you're running something like Windows Analytics or another tool that's letting you know what Office add-ins you've got, if every Office add-in that you've got comes back as something that Microsoft provides as part of Office or as part of Microsoft 365, you're pretty safe knowing you can move over to 64-bit. But but it's not one of those things where you'll get an instant win like you did going from 32-bit Windows to 64-bit Windows, going, hey, I can see more than 3-point-something gig of memory. So this is one of those things that I think will be a slower transition. Even though people have been asking for years, why isn't 64-bit the default recommendation? It was just a matter of just all of the third-party extensions, etc., that were out there weren't really there. Have any of you looked at config.office.com? Yeah. So I'm just looking at the time because I think we're pretty much, I don't have too many slides anyway, so that's, actually, I'll use this one. I must have used all the bandwidth this port had allocated to it. No. Okay, so effectively here we can go through, we can create, or we can import our existing XML files that we may have created with ODT or with Notepad. We can edit them, we can save new ones out. But some of the important things in here that are also worth noticing, making it easy for you to go through and specify internal sources if needed. But with what we see here, this is not a website. This is a web app that's pulling these options from a service. That service, are you ready for this? You know where it's going, don't you? The web service is also called by Config Manager. So if you went into Config Manager and said, I want to deploy see, 64-bit done by default. Let's say Pro Plus. We'll say yes to everything. Why isn't it letting me select a channel? I probably need to answer a few more questions before it lets me do that. But in here, if it was letting me drop down and select a channel, let's say if I did, chose monthly or semi-annual, all of the releases that it gave me as options to install instead of the current one, if I went into Config Manager, it would be exactly the same options. If I go to Intune, it's also calling this service. So as much as this website is interesting, the different deployment teams that Microsoft have got are basically querying this so that you're seeing the same, you're not necessarily seeing the same options, because Intune and Config Manager are not going to expose every single thing that we can do here, because once we start scrolling down into application preferences, here we really do have thousands of settings. So if you have been sort of restricted by some of the things you could do with that XML file in the past, and especially if you've been used to the old Office customization tool and the old Office resource kit tools, it's all here. For better or for worse, depending on your environment, it's all back in there. So that's a pretty important change, but just sort of making it easier, and they've had preview versions of this site for available, but it's really just taken them. Actually, it's still in preview, but it's one of those things that it's going to make it a lot easier for people who are making the transition. So there'll be a generation of people deploying Office 365 that never get to edit the configuration XML file. It's a pretty sad world we're moving to. No, not really, not at all. Now they're also working on, there are more features that are sort of coming through, so that they'll sort of have some default configurations, etc. So they really want to make this way more functional moving forward. Now we'll just move on to the final section. So Azure AD, passwordless and baseline conditional access. So the first passwordless option that we'll have is that we can, so it's been available for Microsoft accounts for a while, but they've just put it into public preview for Azure AD accounts. Have any of you played around with this yet? So don't go poking around through the Azure portal, figuring out where to turn it on. You just have to run a PowerShell script. It's like 2 lines. So you can go in and do it pretty easily. But the way that it works is, actually, for time I won't demonstrate, we can just walk through it here, is rather than having to type the password in, on our screen, it will give us the corresponding, it'll give us one number, and we need to choose the matching number. Now, the reason why it doesn't just have an OK button is because we're already starting to see situations where MFA fatigue has been something where someone has let something in not realizing it wasn't them who did it. So this way, if something pops up and the number you're seeing has got nothing to do with a number you've got on your screen, you hit reject. Just hit deny there. Now, other options that you'll see starting to light up pretty soon. Now, I've got a screenshot in here of it because it's not real. If you go into the Azure portal and jump into AD and go into authentication methods, you are not going to see this screen. All you'll really see in this screen for now is if you're using Azure AD Connect to synchronize against on-prem AD, for it to go through and start rejecting stupid passwords that your users may still be trying to use. So basically, it's all you really see at the moment is that Azure AD password filtering in there. Now, I think this is my final slide. So timing 2:28. Yeah, perfect. Yes, perf. Yeah. Accidental pun. Good work. Yeah. So really, the main thing that I want to talk about here is, so how many of you work with Azure Active Directory Premium? Okay, so one of the features that's in Azure Active Directory Premium is conditional access, where based on a set of criteria, you can either annoy the hell out of users, block the users, or let them through if you deem them trustworthy. One of the things so for now, what Microsoft is doing, they've already enabled it for Azure AD admin roles, is effectively what they're calling baseline protection, where you don't get to control any of the dials. Instead, they're using their, 40 terabytes per day of machine learning data to make decisions on whether they view this as a good decision or a bad decision. Now, what they'll have moving forward is they'll also move to the point where they'll enable this by default for all users. Now, this doesn't mean that if you bought Azure AD Premium just for conditional access, you're probably not going to drop Azure AD Premium just to get these features. But this is effectively just something that Microsoft has to do to be a good cloud citizen. So things where they're going, well, hang on, impossible travel, or no one from your organization has ever attempted to log in 300 times in a row from insert a country. See, I'm not allowed to say. Oh, the only country that I will say is North Korea. That's a safe one, knowing that you won't offend anyone in the room. So the reason why Microsoft has to do this is because people are not enabling security in their Azure AD environments. Last year, 0.7% of Azure AD admins had MFA enabled. There was good news this year. They grew fairly close to 100%. they're up to 1.2% of admins have MFA enabled. And that should horrify everyone in the room. So these are things where, Microsoft is, I don't want to say getting heavy-handed. This is just one of the things that they need to do. And when we start looking at some of the types of attacks that they're going to sort of assist users with here, things like the blocking legacy authentication protocols. When you take a look at, like how many of you, not saying your environment, but you know someone who's had an Office 365 account compromised by some kind of brute force password attack or a spray attack. And someone's gotten into the environment, figured out who's who because they've got access to the GAL, and they've somehow convinced someone in the organization to pay an invoice to a different bank account to what it would. So it was 2 weeks ago I was chatting to someone where the amount was kind of a first for me, where the amount was 400K and it was paid without question. And some of that stuff is kind of nerve-wracking. So blocking legacy authentication protocols, requiring MFA when risk is enabled, making sure users are enrolled. So these are things where Microsoft is saying, look, we don't give you a choice if you're setting up an Outlook.com account. You have to enable MFA, otherwise you can't create an account. On the user side, I'm not saying that all of your business users would necessarily be better equipped for MFA today than they were a few years ago, but a lot of them definitely are. A lot of them have gone through MFA setup for other bits and pieces. What you'll probably need to do is wean them off Google Authenticator onto Microsoft Authenticator so that we can start using things like passwordless, etc. But this is one of those areas where this really should make a huge difference to some of those attacks that are taking place at the moment. But the important thing here is if people still aren't going through their event logs to see what the hell is going on, and whenever you sort of find out when, like this 400K invoice scenario, like I'm sure if we sat down and went through their event logs, all of the warning signs would have been there for months on end. Because when they're attacking, they're not going after that same user account, with thousands of attempts at a go because they know it's not going to work. They'll just keep cycling through a long list and we'll go, oh look, they've been trying to get into your organization for the last 2 years and they finally got in. So these are things that you'll see. So this is already any Azure AD environment. So even if you've just got an Azure subscription set up with a Microsoft account, this is something that you'll see conditional access lights up under Azure Active Directory in there. So that brings it to the end for me. So I think, is it pizza out there or do they bring it in here?
Yes.
But any questions? I'm hanging around for a while. I'm not allowed to leave until I answer. How many questions?
3.
3.
Not
Okay.
gonna be too strict.
Yeah. Okay. So I know I went through a lot pretty quickly, and that's just a subset of some of the things that were announced. One of the important things with Microsoft 365 is just filter down to the things you care about, or the things you need to care about today or this week. Otherwise, you'll go nuts. Okay, so any questions? Yeah.
Delivery optimization, settings around WAN versus LAN.
Yeah, so there's actually ways that we can start grouping the, let me switch out for you. Do I have an in? I'll just open up an in private session. Oh, this also will give the passwordless sign-in demonstration. So good thinking. Thank you. Pretty exciting, 36.
There's an official Microsoft background there as well.
Well, I've got a version of it for another tenant where he doesn't have the gun and he doesn't have the cigarette. So that's how I can tell. Okay, so I should click this before it times out. If you ever need good images, Reddit is the is the place to go. Oops. Yeah, so with delivery optimization, we've got ways we can start targeting different groups of machines inside the organization, because we can't just make an assumption because all these devices are coming from the same publicly facing IP address that we want them to communicate with each other. That would be an absolute disaster for most organizations. So, okay, so I'll show you one other thing in here. How many of you are already using Intune? Okay. How many of you use Intune in the Azure portal? How many of you would like to go straight to Intune by typing in devicemanagement.microsoft.com? So if you really want to see a good session from Ignite, and I strongly recommend it, it was one of the best ones I saw there. Brad Anderson's session, I think GS 0004 or something along those, one of the general sessions, and he went through a lot of the new dashboards. Now, a lot of the dashboards that he's showing look like dashboards, but if you download the presentation, you'll see they're finely crafted presentations with animations, which is telling you it's not going to light up in your environment just yet. Now, what were we talking about? Device configuration. So, sorry, delivery optimization. So if we jump down to Windows 10 update rings, so this is really all that's configured. So I sort of showed you all the things we can do natively through group policy. One of the things that we can do in Intune right now is we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 modes. So HTTP only, no peering, HTTP blended with peering behind same NAT. You can start setting up things like private groups. Do you want internet peering? Do you want simple download mode, bypass mode? So some of these modes are going to be dependent on, are you sitting behind, are they forced to go through some kind of proxying solution that only supports bits, for example? But in terms of, the WAN and targeting things on different parts of the network, this is where we can start saying, okay, well, let's go through it. In this case, we probably start using the peering across private groups. And with the private groups, the way that we can start, let's see what it exposes in here. Oops. Shane, it's not actually giving me any of the options for what we need there. But yeah, I think what we'd need to do from there is go through, drop in a custom policy where we need to start specifying that for this group or that group. But yeah, this is one of those things where they had to get that right. Because even just on a local network with, let's say Wi-Fi that's not optimized for it, it could be quite destructive. So there are a lot of different options around how you configure it. And there's a bit of documentation up on docs.microsoft.com, but it's one of the things where there are still a few things that I haven't gotten good answers for in terms of, they're sort of putting out information around optimization, but there's still, part of me is still struggling to let go of things I want to know about, but I don't actually need to know about. And if you've ever had to work with doing any optimization of branch cache or distribution points and things like that, and you're thinking, no, I must control everything. In this case, they're saying, have faith in the system that they've got in place here for you. So yeah, so you do have multiple options around that, and as I said, docs.microsoft.com will go through and cover that. So yeah, I was expecting when we clicked on across private group. So with the private group, I think we can target 80 sites. We could also put in a marker, an entry in the DHCP scope so that they're recognized there as well. So there are a few different ways we can go through and do that targeting. Anything else, or is it pizza o'clock? Pizza clock.
Yeah, all right. Could be pizza o'clock. Awesome. That was, yeah.
Thank you for joining us at the IT Pro community. I want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Microsoft and Sorosin, your System Center experts. If you want to see more, subscribe to our channel and click the bell to get notified when we put up new content. And feel free to leave your suggestions for future events in the comments below. For more details on upcoming events or to join us live at our next meeting, join our meetup community at the link provided.